And so I'll start it off with this webinar entitled Apollo's Lyre and Our Septenary Universe. During this talk, we'll take a look at the creative power of sound at all levels, from how logoi employ the AUM to establish their ring pass knot of manifestation at the beginning of each cycle, to how disciples and initiates use sound on the path of return. So, according to the Greek creation myth, when Hermes, who was conceived by Zeus and born of a night sky nymph named Maya, was just a couple of hours old, he left his birth cave and, walking just a few steps, chanced upon a tortoise shell, an early symbol of the universe, which he broke into pieces and refashioned into a lyre or harp. By noon of that same day, Hermes had taught himself to play and sing. That evening, he stole Apollo's cattle, and to appease the sun god, gave him his lyre, which Apollo passed on to Orpheus, his son. So, a quick interpretation. Hermes, as an infant leaving his birth cave, represents the emergence of universal mind from Pralaya and the beginning of the fifth root race, during which time the goal for humanity is development of the principle of mind. The tortoise shell symbolizes the now discarded form of the previous Atlantean cycle, ruled by Neptune, hence the tortoise shell, not the living tortoise. This shell, representing the form of what was, must be reshaped into a vehicle appropriate to the new cycle. A bit of genius is shown by Hermes in transforming the now inert Atlantean shell into a living instrument, which in the hands of a logos like Apollo or Sanat Kumara, has the power to bring a new root race into being. Universal law dictates that all creators must use materials from the previous cycle, while at the same time imbuing these materials with the energy of the new cycle. So Hermes, who in this story represents the principle of mind, suffuses his lyre with his fifth root race engendering mental powers before giving it to Apollo, the solar aspect, who in turn passes it on to his son, the Christ-like Orpheus. Okay, in all esoteric traditions, the one indivisible God becomes sevenfold at the beginning of each new cycle. These seven sons of God, called Prajapatis by the Hindus and Elohim by the Christians, are personifications of the seven ray energies. But in all traditions, these seven potencies depend on some feminine persona, like Vash, Hindu goddess of sound, to carry their influence into the world of form. In ancient Greece, this creative aspect was represented by Apollo's lyre, whose seven notes were differentiations of the one great sound, which issues, according to the ageless wisdom, from the divine outbreath. In the beginning of a new cycle, this breath or motion sets up a pulsating rhythmic vibration. DK says, the sound is the sole expression of the ineffable name, the secret appellation of the one in whom we live and move and have our being, and who is known to the Great White Lodge through this name. This shambolic sound brings about the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, who was Orpheus in ancient Greece. It is this second principle that activates the matter of the solar system, causing the pulsating, vibrating substance to take on a directed vibratory activity. So we have the great breath on the logoic plane, followed by sound on the monadic plane, which, as an expression of the will to be, becomes the AUM, the 3-in-1, which then diversifies into certain specific creative words called the sounds of the gods on the atmic plane. These sounds give birth to the 5 abstract elements: ether, air, fire, water, and earth, from which all subsequent forms are wrought. The sound then penetrates down into the Buddhic plane, and there manifests as a synthesis of all the sounds uttered by all forms of life, which on the return path is experienced as the ability to comprehend the sounds uttered by all forms of life. On the higher mental plane, the one sound manifests as the voice of the silence. On the lower mental plane, it makes possible the building of thought forms and the expression of these forms through speech. On the astral plane, the sound becomes the many voices of desire. And finally, on the physical plane, the sound reaches its densest point and greatest diversity through what are called the voices of the earth. DK tells us that every form is the result of thought and sound, and thus that every form veils an idea or concept. Therefore, every form, including an incarnated human being, is but the outer symbol of an idea brought forth through sound. And this is true without exception on all the planes of our solar system, and whether these sounds are created by God, man, or Deva. Okay, let's take a closer look at the originating sound. DK says the sound, which was the first indication of the activity of the planetary logos, is not a word, but a full reverberating sound holding within itself all other sounds, all chords and certain musical tones, which have been given the name of the music of the spheres, and dissonances, unknown as yet to the modern ear. It is the sound which the rising one must learn to recognize, and to which he must respond, not only by means of the sense of hearing and its higher correspondences, but through a response from every part and aspect of the form nature in the 3 worlds. This primordial sound issuing from the monadic plane is symbolized by the letters A, U, and M. DK tells us that each of these mystic letters stands for the first letter of a phrase, consisting of specific syllables, which on the atmic plane become the form-building agencies whose essence is fohat, or self-aware intelligent electricity. Considering the AUM evolutionally, its first letter, the M, with its 5 down-pointing vertices, represents, I said evolutionally, but it's actually involutionally. Considering the AUM involutionally, its first letter, the M, with its 5 down-pointing vertices, represents a sequence of 5 sounds and is thus associated with Hermes, the 5th root race, universal mind, the intelligence aspect that dominates matter, and the element ether. The vibratory quality of the M associates it with Manas, Maya, and all aspects of the form world. When uttered by the logos in a certain key, the 5 syllables associated with this first letter initiate the downward vortex of energy that results in the form aspect of our septenary universe. Every scheme chain, round, globe, root race, and subrace is reawakened into activity and thus brought into outer manifestation through the sounding of some particular series of mantra derived from this fivefold sequence of word tones, which is in turn taken up by great deva lords and subdivided into a plethora of specific lesser sounds by the myriads of devas and elementals who condition substance for the creation of some specific form. These lesser grades of devas and elementals, called the army of the voice, work unconsciously and are directed in their activity by the words and sounds impressed on them by more evolved groups of self-aware devas. When, during the building of our current cycle, the influence of this fivefold logoic letter reached the mental plane, it set up a vibration that caused the matter of that plane to take spheroidal form, which DK tells us is held in coherent shape by Agni, a mighty Devic entity, the Raja Lord of the mental plane, the mastery of which is the goal of this fifth root race. The dynamic that substands the mental plane, the nature of the fifth principle of mind, and thus the mathematical key to the unfoldment of the fifth root race, is hidden in the geometry of the pentagon, and by extension, the five-pointed star and the dodecahedron, all of whose angles are ruled by phi, the golden ratio, one of the keys to the proliferation of form. Possibly it's for this reason that the Pythagoreans considered the very existence of the dodecahedron to be a secret of initiation. DK tells us that when sounded forth on the right note, the five letters associated with this first letter of the AUM, quote, give the key to the true inwardness of matter and also to its control. For this reason, this first letter almost certainly activates and directs the form-building energies of phi. For the initiating sound that substands all words is, on causal levels, the same sound that substands all color, all motion, and all sacred geometry. Okay, a group of devas on the astral and physical planes carry the work further into substance through the use of a lesser note, which DK describes as, quote, two syllables of the threefold microcosmic word. When uttered by the building devas, these syllables attract matter and build it into outer objective forms. The astral subset of creative sounds instigates desire, and it is this desire-stimulating note, reverberating on the physical plane, that produces the appearance of the seven etheric centers of a human being. These seven chakras are the final septenary expression on the involutionary arc, at least for the human kingdom, and as such are a direct reflection of all higher iterations of the one note becoming seven, of, for example, the seven planetary logoi as chakras in the body logoic, of seven chains, which are chakras in the body of a planetary logos, of seven globes, which are the chakras of each chain, and finally of the seven root races, which act as the chakras of each globe. All are brought into manifestation through the sevenfold sound. Okay, the next sound, the U in the AUM, represents a phrase of seven letters, a letter for each of the seven sacred planets, which embody the sevenfold sound or note of the Vishnu or second logoic aspect, and is thus the sound which brings into manifestation the incarnated soul. This sevenfold note is imbued with the radiant love of God and thus brings the law of attraction into expression. It is sounded continuously throughout every cycle of manifestation. So we see that sound is not only the means of creation, but also substance all continued existence. In fact, if this sound series of tones were to stop sounding, all manifestation would cease. For that which holds existence together is, in fact, a great vibratory matrix created by and sustained through the 7 words or phrases associated with this second great letter. DK says, just as long as the great existence, who is the sum total of all forms and of all states of consciousness, notice the M and the U, continues to sound the cosmic AUM or AUM, just so long will the objective, tangible solar system persist. The third letter of the AUM represents a word of 9 letters, which, when this final word is sounded, it dissociates spirit from form, producing spiritual synthesis. DK tells us that these 9 letters correspond to the 9 initiations. Each initiation a more complete expression of this final letter, thus marking a more perfect union of the self with the all-self, and further liberating the indwelling spark from the quote-unquote trammels of matter. Okay, there are many ways to chronicle the upward way. It can be described in terms of the rising kundalini, the unfolding petals of the egoic lotus, of passage through the mutable, fixed, and cardinal crosses, of personality soul ray alignment, or of the awareness gained through successive initiations. But during the rest of this talk, we'll consider the upward journey in terms of recognition of, response to, identification with, and becoming oneself, a creator through sound. So, when on the evolutionary path, it becomes time for the disciple to take up the creative sound, him or herself, the word used to counter the hold of the material forces set up by the omnipresent AUM is the OM, or Om, which when sounded in concert with the soul, counters the influence of the physical, astral, and lower mental worlds. DK tells us that whereas the M in the AUM represents matter, the M in the OM represents the imprisoned soul enveloped in matter, thus shifting the entire expression up an octave. Unlike the triple sound of the AUM, which creates unity in the form aspect, the dual sound of the OM works to release one from the form aspect and strengthen the relation between spirit and soul, between life and consciousness. Like the AUM, the OM is a symbolic word, the actual sound of which is, we're told, the first letter of the 7-fold name of the planetary logos. Sounding the Om in concert with the higher self gradually brings in the nature and potencies of one's soul ray. For this reason, use of the Om slowly but surely leads the initiate to liberation and resurrection, to, quote, the secret place of the Most High, when all other words and sounds have failed. These two groups of word tones don't only exert their influence when sounded forth by an aspirant, disciple, or initiate. In fact, they continually permeate the field of human awareness. DK tells us that those in the human family characterized by mass consciousness are unconsciously living their lives in response to the AUM, whereas those at more advanced levels are seeking release from this vibration, this omnipresent, environing word tone. Those who have integrated their personalities respond to both the AUM and the OM. And these two sound fields epitomize the conflict of the pairs of opposites during their struggle on the upward way. Not until the third initiation, when the personality as a separative identity disappears, is the initiate able to perfectly express the AUM and thus stand free of its vibratory influence. It's interesting. First of all, it must be perfectly expressed, and then you can stand free of it. At the moment of this release, the initiate, we're told, begins to faintly hear the originating sound for the first time. Rule 10 from Raised Initiations describes this point of attainment. Let the army of the voice be no more heard, and let the brothers onward move within the sound. Then let them know the meaning of the OM, and let them hear that OM as it is sounded forth by him who stands and waits at the very center of the council chamber of the Lord. In addition to these two great involutional and evolutional sound fields, there are also mantras that indicate acceptance and seal the completion of certain successive integrations, as well as mantras through which certain great beings can be reached. There are also linking words sounded throughout the hierarchy that align monad and the spiritual triad, masters and their ashrams, even words that link Shambhala with the hierarchy. Okay. DK tells us that sounding forth vocally upon the physical plane means little unless one sounds the word within one's head and heart. The goal in so doing is to align oneself with the source of sound, to realize that all self-initiated sound is one with the ever-present sound. This is always written in all caps. This requires a rigorous retuning of the lower sheaths. In fact, until the personality becomes a co-creator, the fundamental purpose of the word sounded not by the personality, but by the soul, is to turn the outer sheath, is to tune the outer sheaths that house the soul. DK says the Om is useless to most people, even though trained students may now be deriving benefit from its use. This general uselessness is caused not only because people do not use the word correctly, but also because even when using it, they are not holding its significance firmly in their consciousness. So it is with a word of power. That said, it is nonetheless through what DK calls the sounding board of the mouth that a knowledge of the world of creative processes and an understanding of the laws whereby all forms come into being can eventually come to be known. So let's take a closer look at the use of sound on the path of return. The unavoidable first step on the way which leads a disciple up through the 7 sound fields is to still the lowest 2 of these, the voices of the earth and of the astral plane. Initially, this is done through the sounding of the word by the soul, aided by the purificatory practices of the aspirant disciple with special emphasis on right speech. Why speech? Because as the organ of sound, speech is uniquely qualified to ground the vibration of the higher realms in the 3 worlds of human endeavor, and is thus a primary tool of the white magician. In fact, the yoga of sound, utilizing the power of the word, allows the magician to shape the building forces as a means of service. Discipleship in the New Age, Volume 1, gives us a simple meditation exercise that helps us to deepen our use of the OM. In fact, I think two of you used this yesterday. First, sound the OM as a personality. Do so at the highest mental point, raising your aspiration at the same time with the mind to the soul. Second, sound the OM as the soul, breathing it out as the will to love all beings and arresting its descent at the astral body. Do this by an act of the will and the use of the creative imagination. Third, having thus vitalized the astral body and imagined the fusion of soul, personality, and astral force, then direct this triple stream of energy to the heart center, rushing it there, if I might so express it, unquote. Okay. While treading the upward way, some disciples develop the power to hear on the astral plane. This is not an inherently spiritual sense, though when free of desire and controlled by the soul, it can lead to telepathic sensitivity as well as to an understanding of the purpose for the existence of the astral plane. But whether or not clairaudience is developed, when thought is controlled and speech is rightly used, the voices of the physical and astral planes subside, and the master in the heart can begin to make its presence felt. Usually, an aspirant's initial experience of the true self comes through the promptings of his or her conscience, which helps to veil the way to unselfish living reveal the way to unselfish living by sounding a note of warning when there is a deviation from the upward path. Paying attention to these promptings loosens the grip of form life. Over time, this sense of a guiding conscience evolves into the observer, an inner presence that takes note of one's thoughts, speech, and actions, and gives us the power to interpret our life's experiences. Through alignment with this inner observer, the voice of the silence begins to emerge, revealing itself through a revelation of the plans with which the now committed disciple may cooperate, and which it is his or her privilege to help bring into manifestation. This stage is described in HPB's book entitled Voice of the Silence. Before the soul can hear, the image, man, has to become as deaf to roarings as to whispers, to cries of bellowing elephants as to the silvery buzzing of the golden firefly. Before the soul can comprehend and may remember, she must unto the silent speaker be united, just as the form to which the clay is modeled is first united with the potter's mind. For then the soul will hear and will remember, and then to the inner ear will speak the voice of the silence. From the soul's perspective, the all-pervasive word called pranava in Sanskrit, and which takes form on the abstract levels of the mental plane, is directed via the sutratma and the consciousness of the disciple into the physical brain. This sounding forth by the soul has to be constantly repeated. And before the word can be truly anchored in the brain, the disciple must first recognize the word as coming from the soul and earnestly reflect on its vibratory quality. The inevitable effect of this reflection is a realization that the nature of consciousness itself is love, and that the disciple is him or herself, the AUM, the quote-unquote word made flesh, and that in truth, Each of us is an outer manifestation of that same word. DK describes this level of attainment. He is one who has the eye trained to see beyond the fogs and miasmas of the earth to that center of peace, which presides over all earth's happenings, and that trained attentive ear which, having caught a whisper of the voice of the silence, is kept tuned to that high vibration and is thus deaf to all lesser alluring voices. This again brings loneliness and produces that aloofness which all less evolved souls feel when in the presence of those who are forging ahead. So a quick recap of how the personality and soul connect through sound. First, the soul breathes forth the word. Second, the Sutratma transmits the word throughout the mental, emotional, and etheric sheaths. Third, these sheaths are stimulated to increase their vibratory rate until they are aligned with the vibratory rate of the soul. Fourth, the brain is trained to recognize and vibrate in unison with the soul. And fifth, through meditation, the disciple further aligns with the still small voice and begins to assimilate his or her soul's purpose and direction. Eventually, a constant rhythmic response to the thought energy of the soul is created, and a steady flow of force between the soul on its own plane and the disciple is established. During the next stage, the voices emanating from the physical, astral, and lower mental planes fade out altogether, for the transfer to soul consciousness has been completed, and there is nothing within the initiate's awareness left to respond to these lower voices. They have become simply sources of information about the outer world that help that initiate to serve more effectively, nothing more. Now, in lockstep with soul purpose, the initiate's head, heart, and throat centers not only sound, but literally form words, and are thus able to participate in the building of the forces of light, sending them forth to swell the egoic sound. This sets in motion matter on the mental plane in such a way that these co-created thought forms become the outward directing agencies of egoic purpose. Through higher clairaudience, whose counterpart on the Buddhic plane enables comprehension of the sound uttered by all forms of life, the adept initiate now perceives the threefold nature of all forms. Its spiritual essence or idea, the sound or word being expressed by that spiritual essence, and the outer form which symbolizes that spiritual essence. With this awareness, the adept is able to unveil through the Buddhic sense of comprehension, that's a sense of sound on the Buddhic plane, the underlying characteristics of any form. For example, such an adept can discern by means of a particular range of tones heard by the inner ear, the ray qualities that a given form is demonstrating. This is the last phase of perceived duality, for eventually the voice of the silence merges into the voice of the initiate and thus dies out as a separate guiding force. At a later stage, even the directing word from the Buddhic plane is superseded until only the sound emanating from the monadic plane remains. This is the sound which reverberates throughout and permeates the formless worlds. It is the sound to which the spiritual triad responds and of which the initiate is now a part, because he has himself, I use the male gender to denote the spirit aspect, become one with the source of this universal sound. which he now intones as he proceeds upon his creative way. And I'd like to close with this quote from Rays and Initiations. It should be pointed out that he who stands at the very center of the council chamber of Shambhala sounds forth all words, the word, and he also utters the sound. This is apt to be forgotten. He it is who intones the AUM and all things come to be. He it is who voices the word, the OM, and God incarnates in humanity, and God incarnate in humanity appears on earth. He it is who utters the sound, and upon that outgoing breath holds all things in life. And in the rise and fall of its cadences, there is found the cyclic rhythm of the creative process. He it will be who withdraws the sound and, centering the vibration within himself, will someday bring to a close this periodic manifestation and carry the sound to other localities in space, holding it in quiescence on the withdrawn breath until a later cycle of expression dawns. Then it will again be exhaled and sent forth to provide a new field of experience for the lives which in cyclic rhythm again seek to manifest. The entire story of incarnation is hidden in the understanding of the sound and its differentiation into the OM and the AUM. Thank you.